The idea of acceptance is something that I literally stumbled across one night while I was out walking on the street. And so what had happened was, so this was after I'd already done a 6-month course of exposure and response prevention therapy to deal with my anxiety disorders. So it's incredibly effective. It was amazingly effective. I had reduced the compulsions in my life. So I was dealing with all sorts of obsessive compulsive disorder compulsions. And in addition to other anxiety disorders, they all kind of pile in together. And this course of exposure and response prevention therapy had been incredibly effective, but still often I would get a lot of these what are called intrusive thoughts. Anxious thoughts would pop into my head, and I would spend a lot of time ruminating on them and trying to reassure myself that everything was okay. Because what happens is exposure and response prevention therapy is very, very effective at cutting out overt compulsions. So things like going to check the stove, washing compulsively, looking in mirrors, checking door locks, all sorts of compulsions, eating compulsions, things like that. But a lot of the times our compulsions are in our heads. They're different ways of thinking. And we often don't think that those are actions. But really they are. Thinking about something, trying to remember something, trying to remind yourself that everything is going to be okay, telling yourself that everything is good, everything is fine, everything is safe, that's a compulsion too. And I hadn't really dealt with those. So one night, and this is how I stumbled across acceptance, it was lying on the sidewalk. One night, I remember it was a Sunday, and I'm pretty sure I was going to the drugstore. I had to pick up something that I'd run out of before the week started. So this was after dinner. And the drugstore was open late, so I was like, okay, I can make it. So I left the house, and I get about a block away from my house, and the thought pops into my head, what if you left the stove on after dinner? Did you really turn off the stove? And I had to pause and think about it. And so what had been happening since I had finished exposure and response prevention therapy, since I'd finished ERP, is that when that thought would pop into my head, I would try to remember if I had turned off the stove. So I knew not to go back. I knew that going back to the house and checking, would only make my OCD worse. That's one of the things that causes OCD. So those compulsions lead to obsession. So I knew I couldn't do that. But what had happened was, so I'd managed to cut out those overt compulsions, the compulsions you see. I knew I had to keep going to the drugstore. But what would happen is, in the past, is that as I was going then to the drugstore, I would just keep reminding myself, no, it's probably turned off. You have to keep walking, but I'm pretty sure I can remember turning it off, and I would do what's called reassurance. I would reassure myself, it's okay, everything's gonna be fine, everything is safe, you turned it off, you remember turning it off, you turned off the stove, you took the pot, you threw it in the sink, it's in cold water, it can't light on fire and burn the house down, everything's okay. So I would try to be certain. And then eventually, so I wouldn't go back, I'd go to the store, I'd come back, I would see that it had been turned off, and then everything would be fine. But that act of reassuring myself was exacerbating and making my OCD continue, because I was still engaging in compulsions. And then, so this one night, so I'd left the house, this thought pops into my head, what if you left the stove on? And for whatever reason, after years, this was after, this is like 29, 30 years of practicing OCD, finally, it occurred to me, why do I keep answering these questions? And that right there is one of the things that's at the core of what I've since come to know is referred to as acceptance. So at the time, I didn't know there was a thing called acceptance. At the time, I was just like, of course, yeah, why do I keep answering these questions? And at the time, so I just said, I don't know if the stove is on. It might be, and it might not be. And that not answering the question is an incredibly powerful solution to a lot of the problems with OCD. So when it comes to OCD, or really any anxiety disorder, a lot of the time the problem doesn't arise from having too much anxiety. The problem arises from reacting to the intrusive thought that pops into your head. A lot of all the problems that we deal with comes from an attempt to be certain. So a question pops into your head, or an uncertainty, and then you try to answer it. So in the past, I would have tried to answer, did I leave the stove on? And then I keep trying to answer it and answer it and answer it. And of course, I can never be certain, because even when I was reassuring myself, even if I can remember, I remember turning it off, I'm not standing in front of the stove. I can't be sure I didn't turn it off. My brain, being the anxious brain that it is going to say, well, are you really sure? Are you sure that memory is from today and not from yesterday? And so what's helped tremendously, and so this, I really, really encourage you to try this, is to just not answer the question. When a question pops into your head, just treat it as a question. It's just like weather, just sort of passing through your brain. It's like a cloud. So there's a cloud. You don't have to react to the cloud. You don't have to believe it means something. You don't have to label the cloud. You don't have to try and decide what color the cloud is or be certain about what shape the cloud is. It's just a cloud. You get one of these questions in your head, it's just a question. You don't have to answer it. And so that's one of the core ideas when it comes to acceptance, is just accepting what's happening in your head. So your brain, you know it's anxious, you know it's going to ask questions, and you've seen by this point, if you've been struggling with an anxiety disorder for a long time, you can never be certain. You're never going to be able to answer those questions. So just stop trying to answer them. And you'll find that once you stop answering those questions, your brain isn't going to throw them at you anymore, because your brain loves to save energy. So your brain loves to do things that you're going to react to. If you don't react to what your brain throws at you, it's not going to throw it at you. So try that this week. When your brain throws questions at you, no matter what the question is, don't answer it.